The clock on the wall showed 7:30 when Maya wiped down another table and tucked the tip into her apron pocket. Just another Friday night at the restaurant. Nothing special about it. The same faces she'd served 100 times before. The same orders, the same small talk about the weather and weekend plans. She'd been working at Romano's Italian kitchen for 3 years now. 3 long years of carrying heavy plates, memorizing specials, and pretending her feet didn't ache by the end of each shift. Most people probably thought she was just a waitress, and maybe that's all she was in this moment. But inside she carried dreams that felt heavier than any tray of food she'd ever balanced. Music had always been her real love. Ever since she was 7 years old, sitting beside her grandmother on that old wooden piano bench, feeling the vibrations of the keys under her small fingers, her grandmother would guide her hands, teaching her scales and simple melodies, telling her that music was a language that could say things words never could. Those afternoons felt like magic, like she was learning to speak in colors instead of sounds. But life has a way of getting complicated. Her grandmother passed away when Maya was 16, and with her went the piano lessons, the encouragement, the belief that maybe she could actually make something of this talent. Community college came next, paid for by tips and weekend doubles at the restaurant. She'd planned to save enough for a real music school, one of those prestigious conservatories where people actually became professional musicians. But saving money on a waitress salary was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Every time she got close, something would happen. Her car would break down, or rent would go up, or her roommate would move out and she'd have to cover the full lease. The restaurant itself wasn't a bad place to work. Tony, the manager, was decent enough. He didn't yell like some bosses she'd heard about, and he was usually fair about the schedule. The kitchen staff were friendly, always sneaking her a plate of pasta on busy nights when she forgot to take a break. The regular customers knew her by name, asked about her classes, left okay tips most of the time. But there was one thing in that restaurant that both comforted and haunted her. In the far corner near the window that looked out onto the street sat an upright piano. It was old, with scratches on its dark wood finish and keys that had yellowed with age. Tony had bought it at some estate sale about a year ago, thinking it would add atmosphere to the place, make it feel more authentic, more Italian, even though Maya was pretty sure most Italian restaurants in Italy didn't have random pianos sitting around. Most nights, that piano just sat there. Decoration. Something for people to glance at while they waited for their breadsticks. The staff used the top of it to stack extra menus during busy rushes. A few times, someone had sat down and plunked out chopsticks or happy birthday for a celebration, but that was about it. The piano tuner came twice a year, which seemed wasteful to Maya since hardly anyone played it. Every single shift, Maya looked at that piano. She couldn't help it. Sometimes while taking orders, she'd hear a melody in her head and her fingers would tap against her order pad, playing invisible keys. During slow moments, she'd drift toward it, running her hand along the smooth wood, lifting the fallboard just enough to see the keys underneath. A couple of times when she was alone closing up, she'd pressed a single key just to hear the note ring out in the empty space, but she'd never actually played it. Never sat down and let her hands do what they were trained to do. Why not? She asked herself that question 100 times. Maybe it was fear. Fear that she wasn't as good as she remembered. Fear that everyone would stop and stare. Fear that Tony would tell her to get back to work. That she wasn't hired to be entertainment. Or maybe it was something deeper than that. Maybe playing that piano would force her to face how much time had passed since she'd seriously practiced, how far she'd drifted from the dream her grandmother had believed in. Tonight felt different somehow, though she couldn't quite say why. The dinner rush had come and gone earlier than usual. A big party of 20 had canceled at the last minute, leaving the reservation book full of empty space. By 8 o'clock, there were only maybe 10 people scattered across the dining room. Old Mr. and Mrs. Patterson sat by the window like they did every Friday, sharing a bottle of red wine and talking in quiet voices. A businessman in a wrinkled suit hunched over his laptop at table 7, occasionally remembering to take a bite of his chicken parmesan. A younger couple on what looked like a first date occupied a booth in the back, both of them nervously laughing too loud at everything the other person said. The background music that usually played through the restaurant speakers had stopped about an hour ago. Someone probably forgot to restart the playlist, but nobody seemed to notice or care. The silence felt strange after years of Italian pop songs and instrumental versions of famous operas playing on loop. Maya found herself actually aware of the quiet, the way you suddenly notice when a fan stops running or when rain finally stops hitting the window. She'd finished all her side work early. The salt and pepper shakers were filled. The sugar caddies were restocked. She'd rolled enough silverware sets to last through tomorrow's lunch rush. Tony was in the back office doing payroll, and the cooks were starting their closing checklist. The sound of running water and clanging pots echoing from the kitchen. Maya stood near the server station, wiping down a table that was already clean, just to have something to do with her hands. Her eyes kept drifting to that piano. In the dim evening light coming through the windows, it almost seemed to glow. Or maybe she was just tired, her mind playing tricks after a long week of classes and shifts that blurred together. Something was building inside her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. It was like pressure, or maybe longing, or maybe just exhaustion mixed with that particular kind of sadness that comes from watching your dreams gather dust in the corner of a room. How many more Friday nights would she spend like this? How many more years would pass before she admitted that maybe the music thing just wasn't going to happen for her? Her feet started moving before her brain could talk her out of it. She set down her cleaning rag and walked toward the piano, her heart starting to beat faster with each step. This was probably a bad idea. Tony might come out and tell her to stop. Customers might complain. She was still on the clock, still in her uniform with her apron on and her order pad in her pocket. But her hand was already reaching for the bench, pulling it out from under the piano. The leather seat was cracked and worn, but it felt solid as she sat down. Her hands trembled just slightly as she lifted the fallboard, revealing all those keys she'd been dreaming about touching. They looked back at her like old friends she'd been ignoring for too long. Maya took a deep breath and let her fingers find their place on the keys. Home position, just like her grandmother had taught her. She could almost hear that gentle voice in her memory, patient and encouraging. Music isn't about being perfect, her grandmother used to say. It's about being honest. Well, Maya thought, maybe it was time to be honest. The first note came out softer than Maya expected. Middle C, clear and simple, hanging in the air of the quiet restaurant. She pressed it again, then added the E above it, then G. A basic C major chord, the kind every beginner learns on their first day. But hearing it now, after so long, felt like coming home after years away. Her hands remembered more than her mind did. That's what surprised her most. She'd worried that 3 years without serious practice would have erased everything, that her fingers would stumble and forget where they belonged. But the moment she started playing, muscle memory took over. It was like her hands had been waiting for this, storing up all those childhood lessons and late-night practice sessions, ready to pour it all out the second she gave them permission. She started with something easy. A simple melody her grandmother had taught her when she was 8 years old. Just a folk song, really, nothing fancy, the kind of tune you could hum while washing dishes. Her fingers moved slowly at first, cautious, relearning the geography of the keyboard. The piano was slightly out of tune, she noticed. The F sharp was a little flat, and some of the higher notes had that tinny quality that comes with age. But somehow that made it better, more real, less intimidating than the perfect concert grands she'd played in college recitals. She didn't notice right away when the businessman at table 7 looked up from his laptop, or when Mrs. Patterson stopped mid-sentence, her wineglass paused halfway to her lips. Maya had her eyes closed now, letting the music guide her instead of watching her hands. That's what her grandmother always said to do once you knew a piece well enough. Stop looking. Start feeling. The folk song ended, and without thinking, Maya transitioned into something a little more complex. A piece by Chopin she'd learned in high school, one of the easier nocturnes but still beautiful. Her fingers stretched across the keys, finding the reaching chords and delicate runs. There was a part in the middle where her left hand had always struggled with the timing, and sure enough, she stumbled over it now. But she kept going, pushing through the mistake the way her piano teacher had always insisted. Don't stop when you mess up. The music doesn't stop in real life. The restaurant had gone completely silent except for the piano. Even the sounds from the kitchen had quieted down. Maya didn't know it, but the cooks had stopped their cleaning to listen, standing in the doorway with soapy hands and curious expressions. Tony had looked up from his paperwork, hearing something unusual cutting through the normal end-of-shift sounds. As Maya played, something started to shift inside her. The nervousness that had made her hands shake at first began to melt away. In its place came something else, something that felt like relief or maybe release. like she'd been holding her breath for 3 years and was finally letting it out. All the frustration of her daily routine, all the disappointment of deferred dreams, all the exhaustion of trying to convince herself that giving up on music was the practical, responsible thing to do, it all poured out through her fingers and into those keys. The Chopin piece ended, and Maya's hands hovered over the keyboard for just a moment. She could stop now. She'd scratched the itch, proven to herself that she still remembered how to play. She could close the fallboard, stand up, go back to refilling ketchup bottles and counting her tips for the night. That would be the sensible thing to do, but her hands had other ideas. They moved into position for something different, something she hadn't planned on playing, especially not here, especially not now. It was a piece she'd been working on in secret for the past 6 months. Her own composition, something she'd never played for anyone, barely even played for herself except in fragments, late at night on the electric keyboard in her tiny apartment, with the volume turned down so the neighbors wouldn't complain. This piece was personal. It was about all the things she couldn't figure out how to say with regular words, about watching dreams slip away while you're too busy surviving to chase them, about loving something so much it hurts to even think about it, about her grandmother's hands guiding hers across the keys and how some absences never really fade. They just become part of the music you carry inside you. Her right hand started with a simple melody line, almost hesitant, like someone asking a question they're afraid to hear the answer to. The left hand came in underneath, providing harmony but also tension, notes that didn't quite resolve the way you'd expect them to. Maya had never taken a formal composition class. She didn't know all the proper rules about chord progressions and harmonic structure. She just wrote what felt true, what sounded like the emotions she was trying to express. The piece built slowly. The melody repeated but changed each time, growing more confident, more insistent. Her hands moved faster now, more sure of themselves. She added dynamics, playing some parts so softly they were almost whispers, then swelling into passages that made the whole piano ring. There was a section in the middle that always made her emotional when she played it alone in her apartment. It was the part that reminded her of her grandmother, a quote from one of the old songs they used to play together, woven into her own melody like a memory surfacing in the middle of a dream. Maya felt tears starting to form behind her closed eyelids, but she didn't stop playing. This was why music mattered. This was why she couldn't let it go, no matter how impractical it seemed. Because sometimes you have feelings too big for words, experiences too complex for simple explanations, and the only way to make sense of them is to turn them into sound, into rhythm, into something another person might hear and understand without you having to explain a single thing. The young couple in the back booth had completely forgotten their awkward first date conversation. They sat perfectly still, watching this waitress they'd barely noticed when they walked in, suddenly revealed as something entirely different. Mr. Patterson reached across the table and took his wife's hand, something about the music reminding him of why he'd fallen in love with her 40 years ago. The businessman found himself thinking about the piano lessons his mother had made him take as a kid, lessons he'd complained about and quit as soon as he was old enough to make his own decisions. He wondered now if that had been a mistake. Maya's composition moved into its final section. This was the part she was least sure about, the part she'd rewritten a dozen times and still wasn't convinced she'd gotten right. It was supposed to sound like acceptance but not resignation, like hope but not denial, like moving forward while still honoring what you were leaving behind. She'd been trying to capture that feeling you get when you realize that growing up means letting some versions of yourself die so that new versions can be born. Her fingers found the final chord progression, a series of changes that eventually resolved into a simple major key. Not triumphant exactly, more like peaceful, like someone finally setting down something heavy they'd been carrying too long. She let the last chord ring out, her foot on the sustain pedal, letting every note fade naturally, into silence rather than cutting them off abruptly. Only, when the sound had completely died away, did Maya open her eyes and lift her hands. From the keys, the silence that followed felt enormous. Maya sat frozen on the piano bench, her hands still hovering above the keys, suddenly aware that she'd just done something she couldn't take back. Her heart pounded in her chest as reality crashed back in. She was at work, in her uniform. She'd just stopped doing her actual job to play piano for the last 15 minutes like this was a concert hall instead of a restaurant. Heat rushed to her face. What had she been thinking? Tony was probably furious. The customers probably thought she was weird, some delusional waitress who thought she was better than her job. She started to stand up, already forming an apology in her head when she heard it. Clapping. Not polite, obligatory clapping like when someone finishes singing happy birthday. Real applause. Enthusiastic and genuine. Maya turned toward the sound and saw Mr. Patterson on his feet, his hands coming together in steady, purposeful claps. Mrs. Patterson was still seated, but her hands were clasped over her heart, and there were actual tears running down her cheeks. The businessman had closed his laptop completely and was applauding too, shaking his head with this expression of amazement. The young couple in the back were both clapping, and the girl was saying something to her date, gesturing excitedly toward the piano. From the kitchen doorway, the entire cooking staff had gathered, and they burst into whoops and cheers, one of the line cooks whistling through his fingers the way people do at concerts. Maya stood there completely overwhelmed, not knowing what to do with her hands or where to look. She managed a small, awkward wave, feeling like she might cry or laugh or possibly both at the same time. This wasn't what she'd expected. She hadn't expected anything, really, because she hadn't thought beyond the moment of actually playing. "That was extraordinary," Mr. Patterson said, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. He was walking toward her now, his wife following behind, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "In 40 years of coming to this restaurant, I've never heard anything like that. You wrote that last piece yourself, didn't you?" His wife asked, her voice soft but certain. "I could tell. It had something the other pieces didn't, something personal." Maya nodded, not trusting her voice yet. Mrs. Patterson reached out and squeezed her hand. "It was beautiful, dear. Truly beautiful. That kind of talent doesn't come along very often." The businessman had approached too, and Maya recognized him now. He'd been coming in on Friday nights for the past few months, always ordering the same thing, always buried in his work. She'd never heard him say more than necessary. "I took piano lessons for 8 years as a kid," he said quietly. "Quit when I was 16 because I thought it was uncool. Been regretting it for 20 years. He paused, looking at the piano like it was something precious. "Thank you for reminding me what I gave up." Tony emerged from the back office, and Maya's stomach dropped. Here it comes, she thought. The lecture about professionalism, about staying focused on her job, about how the restaurant wasn't paying her to give concerts. She braced herself for disappointment, but Tony was grinning. Actually grinning, which was something Maya had seen maybe 3 times in 3 years. "Why didn't you tell me you could play like that?" he asked, sounding more amazed than angry. "We've had that piano sitting there for a year and you never said a word." "I didn't think it was appropriate," Maya said, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "I'm supposed to be working, not playing music. Are you kidding?" Tony laughed, looking around at the customers who were all still watching Maya with expressions of wonder. "Do you know how many restaurants would kill to have live music like that? Real music, not some playlist on repeat. You just turned a slow Friday night into something people are going to remember." Before Maya could respond, she noticed something happening at the front of the restaurant. People were coming inside. A couple in their 30s who'd apparently been walking past on the street. Then an older man with a dog who tied the leash to the bike rack outside before stepping through the door. Then 2 more people, then 3 more after that. "We heard music from outside," one of the women explained, looking around the restaurant with curious eyes. "It sounded so beautiful we had to come see what was happening." "Is there a performance tonight?" Tony looked at Maya with raised eyebrows, a question in his expression. She felt panic rising in her chest again. More people meant more attention, more pressure, more chances to disappoint or embarrass herself. But she also felt something else. A tiny spark of something that might have been excitement or possibility, or maybe just the smallest bit of hope. One of the new arrivals caught Maya's attention immediately. He was maybe in his 50s, wearing a casual jacket over a button-down shirt, and he carried himself with a kind of quiet authority. But what really struck her was the way he was looking at the piano, then at her, with an expression of intense interest. "Please," Mrs. Patterson said, turning to address the newcomers. She just played the most magnificent music. Her own composition. It was absolutely breathtaking. "Would you play something else?" the girl from the young couple called out, her earlier date nervousness forgotten in genuine enthusiasm. "Please." That was incredible. Other voices joined in, people requesting an encore. and Maya felt the weight of all those expectant faces. Her instinct was to refuse, to say she'd already pushed her luck far enough. But when she looked at the piano, sitting there with the fallboard still open, the keys still warm from her fingers, she felt that pull again. That need to express something that lived too deep for regular words. "Okay," she heard herself say. "Just one more." The gathered crowd found seats quickly, some people pulling chairs from empty tables, others content to stand along the walls. The restaurant had transformed in the span of minutes from a nearly empty dining room to an impromptu concert venue. Tony dimmed the overhead lights slightly, and someone turned off the fluorescent sign in the window, making the space feel more intimate. Maya sat back down at the piano, and this time she didn't feel afraid. Or at least the fear was still there, but it was mixed with something stronger. She'd spent 3 years playing it safe, keeping her head down, treating her talent like a secret she had to hide. And where had that gotten her? Nowhere. Still stuck, still dreaming, still waiting for someday. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play something different. Not her own composition this time, but a piece that required everything she had. Something technically challenging, emotionally complex, the kind of music that would either prove she belonged at this piano or expose her as a fraud who'd gotten lucky with one good performance. Her fingers flew across the keys, finding runs and trills she hadn't attempted in years. The piano responded, its imperfect tuning somehow adding character rather than distraction. This was a test, she realized. Not for the audience, but for herself. A test to see if the dream she'd been carrying was real, or just a comfortable fantasy she'd been too scared to examine closely. The music swelled and dove, climbing to dramatic heights before dropping into whisper-soft passages that made people lean forward in their seats. Maya felt herself disappearing into the performance, the way she used to during her best practices when she was younger. Time stopped meaning anything. The restaurant, her uniform, her aching feet, the bills waiting at home, all of it faded away until there was nothing but the music and the piano and her hands bringing them together. She was alive in a way she hadn't felt in 3 years. This was who she was supposed to be. The final notes faded into silence, and this time Maya wasn't afraid to open her eyes. The applause came immediately, louder than before, and she let herself smile. Really smile. Not the polite waitress smile she'd perfected over 3 years, but a genuine expression of joy mixed with disbelief at what was happening. People were standing now, most of them on their feet, clapping with real enthusiasm. The businessman was shaking his head in amazement. Mrs. Patterson had fresh tears on her face, and her husband kept saying, "Remarkable, absolutely remarkable," to anyone who would listen. Even the line cooks were hooting from the kitchen doorway, clearly proud that their co-worker had just revealed herself to be something extraordinary. Maya stood from the piano bench, her legs a little shaky, and did an awkward half-bow that made a few people laugh in a warm, appreciative way. She felt lightheaded, like she'd just run a marathon or woken up from an incredibly vivid dream. Was this really happening? Had she actually just performed for a room full of strangers and not completely fallen apart? The man in the casual jacket was making his way toward her through the small crowd. Up close, Maya could see the gray in his hair and the laugh lines around his eyes. He had the look of someone who spent a lot of time listening carefully to things, his head tilted slightly to one side as he approached. "That was exceptional," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Professor David Chen from the State University Music Department. I was just walking past when I heard you playing through the open door. I have to tell you, I've been teaching music for 23 years, and I don't often hear raw talent like that outside of professional concert halls." Maya shook his hand, feeling like the floor had tilted slightly beneath her feet. A professor. A real music professor, not just someone being polite. "Thank you," she managed to say, though her voice came out scratchy. "I used to study music, but that was a while ago." "Used to?" Professor Chen looked genuinely surprised. "You're not currently enrolled anywhere? You're not actively performing?" Maya gave a small, self-conscious laugh and gestured to her uniform. "I'm a waitress. I mean, obviously, you can see that. I took some community college classes, but I had to drop out of the music program. Money issues, you know. Life stuff." Professor Chen was already pulling out his wallet, fishing for something. He produced a business card and pressed it into her hand. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. The university has scholarship auditions coming up for the spring semester. We have several programs specifically designed for non-traditional students and late applicants. The deadline for most people is passed, but I can get you an audition spot if you're interested. Maya stared at the card like it might disappear if she blinked. I don't understand. You just heard me play twice. That's not enough to offer someone an audition. You're right, it's not standard procedure, he admitted. But I heard something in your playing that I very rarely encounter. Technical skill can be taught, but musicality, real emotional depth and performance, that's something you either have or you don't. And that original composition of yours? That showed me you're not just a skilled player. You're an artist. You have something to say. He pulled out his phone and opened up his calendar. The scholarship auditions are in 3 weeks. Normally, applicants need to prepare 3 pieces from different style periods and submit a portfolio. But given the circumstances, I can probably work something out with the committee. That first piece you played tonight, your own composition, that alone shows more promise than half the formal applications we receive. Maya's head was spinning. 3 weeks, scholarship auditions. The state university, which wasn't some distant dream school in another state, but a real place just 40 minutes from where she lived. A place with a respected music program that she'd looked at longingly on their website but assumed was completely out of reach. I don't know what to say, she said honestly. This feels like something that happens in movies, not real life. Professor Chen smiled. I understand it's a lot to process. But here's the thing about talent like yours. It doesn't wait around forever. Life has a way of filling up the space where your dreams used to be if you let it. I've seen too many gifted musicians convince themselves they're too old, too broke, too far behind to pursue what they're clearly meant to do. She should do it, Mrs. Patterson said firmly, having migrated closer during the conversation. Absolutely she should. Young lady, if you don't at least try, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. I agree, the businessman added, joining the growing circle of people around Maya. Look, I don't know you, but I quit something I loved because it seemed impractical, and it's one of my biggest regrets. Don't make the same mistake I did. Tony stepped forward and Maya braced herself, suddenly remembering that she'd essentially abandoned her job duties for the past half hour. But instead of looking annoyed, he looked thoughtful. If you need to adjust your schedule to prepare for this audition thing, we can work something out. Maybe cut back your shifts, give you some evening time to practice. I can't afford to work less, Maya said automatically, the practical part of her brain reasserting itself. My rent is due. I've got student loans from community college. My car needs new tires. What if I told you that the scholarship covers full tuition plus a living stipend? Professor Chen said. It's specifically designed to help students who have financial barriers to attending. Room and board included if you need it. The university wants to support talented students who might otherwise slip through the cracks. Maya felt tears threatening again. But these were different from the emotional tears that came while playing. These were the kind of tears that come when something you'd given up hoping for suddenly becomes possible again. When a door you thought was permanently closed cracks open just enough to see light on the other side. I don't have a piano, she said, hating how small her voice sounded. I have an electric keyboard in my apartment, but it's not the same. I'd need to practice on a real piano to prepare properly. You can use this one, Tony said immediately, surprising everyone including himself by the sound of it. We're closed Sunday and Monday. Come in those days and practice as long as you need. And honestly, if you want to play some Friday and Saturday nights, I think it would be good for business. We could call it live music nights or something. The girl from the young couple spoke up, pulling out her phone. I just posted a video on my social media. I recorded the last song you played. I hope that's okay. It already has like 300 views. Maya's eyes widened. 300 people had watched her play? Strangers on the internet were listening to her music right now. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. There's a practice studio in the music building that's open to community members, Professor Chen continued, clearly not wanting to lose momentum. I can arrange access for you starting next week. You'd have a real piano, soundproofed room, everything you need. Everything was happening so fast. An hour ago, Maya had been a waitress going through another ordinary Friday night shift. Now she was standing in a restaurant surrounded by people telling her she had talent, offering her opportunities, treating her like someone whose dreams actually mattered. I need to think about it, Maya said, even though part of her wanted to say yes immediately. This is just a lot to process all at once. Of course, Professor Chen said kindly, but don't think too long. Like I said, 3 weeks until auditions. My email is on that card. Reach out this weekend if you're interested and we'll get the ball rolling on your application. He started to leave, then turned back. One more thing. That feeling you had while you were playing tonight? That's what the rest of your life could feel like if you choose it. Just something to consider. After he left, the other customers began to filter out too, each one stopping to say something encouraging to Maya. The young couple left a $50 tip on their $20 meal. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson insisted on giving Maya their phone number, telling her to call if she needed anything at all, to help prepare for the audition. When the restaurant finally emptied out, Maya stood alone by the piano, turning Professor Chen's business card over in her hands. The practical voice in her head was already listing all the reasons this was risky. What if she failed the audition? What if she wasn't as good as he thought? What if she gave up her stable job for a dream that didn't work out? But another voice, one that sounded suspiciously like her grandmother, was asking a different question. What if she succeeded? What if this was the moment her life had been building toward? What if saying no to fear was the same thing as saying yes to herself? She looked down at the piano keys, still slightly warm from her playing, and made her decision. Maya didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling of her tiny apartment, Professor Chen's business card on her nightstand, her mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios. By the time morning light crept through her curtains, she'd convinced herself to audition at least a dozen times and talked herself out of it just as many. Saturday morning, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she'd been lost in thought. She pulled up the university's website and read through the music program requirements, the scholarship descriptions, the faculty biographies. Professor Chen's photo was there along with his credentials. He wasn't just some random teacher. He was the department chair, with degrees from prestigious schools and a list of accomplishments that made Maya feel simultaneously inspired and inadequate. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate asking about the rent. Reality check. Even if she somehow got this scholarship, even if everything worked out perfectly, she still had bills to pay right now, today, in the real world where dreams didn't cover electricity costs. But then she thought about last night, about the feeling of her hands on those piano keys, about Mrs. Patterson's tears and the businessman's regret, and the way the whole restaurant had transformed from an ordinary Friday night into something magical, about Professor Chen's words. That feeling you had while you were playing tonight? That's what the rest of your life could feel like if you choose it. She opened her email and started typing before she could overthink it anymore. Dear Professor Chen, thank you for the opportunity you offered last night. I would like to audition for the scholarship program. Please let me know what steps I need to take. Maya Rodriguez. She hit send before reading it over, before editing it to sound more professional, before finding reasons to wait just one more day. Done. Committed. Terrifying. His response came within an hour. Enthusiastic, detailed, full of instructions and encouragement. He'd already spoken to the scholarship committee about making an exception for her late application. She needed to fill out some forms, write a short essay about her musical background and goals, and of course prepare for the audition itself. 3 pieces, he suggested. Her original composition, 1 classical piece that showed technical ability, and 1 piece of her choosing that demonstrated her range. The next 2 weeks became a blur of parallel lives. By day, Maya worked her shifts at the restaurant, serving pasta and clearing tables, her feet aching and her mind elsewhere. But Tony had kept his word. He cut her evening shifts on Sundays and Mondays, and those 2 days became her sanctuary. She'd arrive at Romano's when it was closed and silent, let herself in with the key Tony had given her, and spend hours at that old upright piano. The instrument had become her closest confidant, its slightly out-of-tune keys now familiar and almost comforting. She worked through the technical pieces first, drilling difficult passages until her fingers ached, rebuilding the muscle memory that had grown soft from years of neglect. Her original composition got refined and polished. She'd play through it, find sections that felt weak or unclear, rework them, play it again. The piece evolved, became tighter, more confident. She titled it Waiting Room, because that's what her life had felt like before that Friday night, like sitting in a waiting room for something that might never be called. Professor Chen made good on his promise about the practice studio, too. 3 times that second week, Maya drove to the university campus, felt like an imposter walking through the music building, and spent hours in a small, soundproofed room with a beautiful grand piano. The instrument was so much better than the one at Romano's, responsive and perfectly tuned, and playing it felt like test driving a car you couldn't quite believe you might actually get to own. Other musicians practiced in nearby rooms, and sometimes Maya would hear them through the walls. Students younger than her, most of them, their skill levels varying wildly. Some were brilliant, making her doubt herself all over again. Others were still learning, still struggling, and somehow that was reassuring. Everyone was on their own journey. Maybe it wasn't too late for hers. She ran into Professor Chen once in the hallway, and he stopped to ask how preparation was going. When she expressed her nervousness about competing against traditional students who'd been in formal training their whole lives, he'd smiled and said something that stuck with her. Music isn't a competition. It's a conversation. The question isn't whether you're better than someone else. The question is whether you have something worth saying and the skill to say it clearly. The night before the audition, Maya barely touched her dinner. Her roommate tried to calm her down, reminding her that this was just one audition, one opportunity, and if it didn't work out, there would be others. But Maya knew better. There wouldn't be others. Not really. This was the moment. The chance that comes along once and doesn't knock twice. The door that was open right now but might not stay that way. She went to Romano's late that evening even though it was closed. Sat at the piano in the dark restaurant and played through her pieces one final time. Not for practice anymore. Just to remind herself why she was doing this. To reconnect with the feeling that had started this whole chain of events. When she finally went home and tried to sleep, she dreamed of her grandmother. In the dream, they were sitting together at an old piano and her grandmother's hands were guiding hers just like when she was little. Music isn't about being perfect, Dream grandmother said, repeating words the real one had spoken years ago. It's about being honest. Just tell them your truth. The audition was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Maya arrived an hour early, too nervous to risk being late, and sat in the hallway outside the performance room watching other applicants come and go. They all looked so prepared, so confident, carrying expensive instrument cases and talking casually about their private instructors and summer programs at prestigious conservatories. Then her name was called, and none of that mattered anymore. The audition room was smaller than she'd expected. A beautiful grand piano sat in the center, and 4 faculty members sat at a table against the wall with clipboards and neutral expressions. Professor Chen was there, but he'd warned her he wouldn't be able to show any favoritism during the audition itself. He gave her the same polite professional nod he'd given every other applicant. Maya sat at the piano bench and adjusted her position. Her hands were shaking slightly and her heart was beating so hard she was sure the faculty members could hear it across the room. This was it. Everything she'd worked toward for 2 weeks. Everything she'd dreamed about for 3 years. Maybe everything she'd been building toward, since her grandmother first placed her. Small hands on piano keys when she was 7 years old. Whenever you're ready, one of the faculty members said kindly. Maya took a breath and placed her hands on the keys. And then something shifted inside her. The nervousness didn't disappear exactly, but it transformed into something else. Energy, purpose, clarity. She wasn't here to prove she was the best pianist in the world. She was here to share what she had to offer. To have the conversation that Professor Chen had talked about. To tell her truth through music. She began with her original composition, Waiting Room. And as her fingers found the familiar notes, as the piece unfolded in this new space with this new piano, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like herself. Not the waitress version of herself, not the struggling student version, not the person who'd learned to make herself smaller to fit into practical expectations. Just herself. Complete and honest and alive. The music filled the room and Maya forgot about the faculty members watching her, forgot about scholarships and opportunities and whether she was good enough. She just played. Told her story. Shared her truth. Let the music say all the things she'd never quite found words for. When she finished all 3 pieces and stood from the piano, she knew something had changed permanently. Not because she knew whether she'd get accepted. She had no idea about that. The faculty members' faces remained professionally neutral as they thanked her for her time and told her decisions would be sent out within a week. But walking out of that audition room, Maya knew she'd already won something more important than a scholarship. She'd won herself back. She'd stopped waiting for permission to be who she really was. And whether she got accepted to the program or not, she wasn't going back to sleepwalking through her life, treating her talent like a secret she had to hide. That Friday night, Maya went to work at Romano's, and before her shift started, she sat at the piano and played for the early dinner crowd, not because anyone made her, not because it was required, but because it was who she was. The restaurant started advertising live piano nights with Maya, and people began coming specifically to hear her play. The acceptance letter came on a Tuesday. Full scholarship, living stipend included, welcoming her to the program starting in the spring semester. Maya cried reading it, called her roommate, called Mrs. Patterson, who squealed with delight, texted Professor Chen a thank you that couldn't possibly capture what she felt. But the letter itself wasn't really the ending of her story. It was just confirmation of something that had already happened that night. She first sat down at the piano and decided to stop being afraid. That night she chose herself. That night she learned that sometimes the life you're meant to live doesn't start with perfect circumstances or permission from others. Sometimes it starts with just being brave enough to play your song. Even if your hands are shaking, even if you're scared, even if you don't know how the story ends. Sometimes transformation begins with a single choice to stop waiting and start living. And for Maya, it had begun with a simple tune on a Friday night that turned into something so much more.